Good afternoon. I am Dr. Stephanie Rose Spalding, Interim Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and I welcome you to our second in a series of teach-ins on AAPI community here at UCCS and beyond. Welcome to From Orientalism to Yellow Peril, a history of Asians in the United States. We began this series in response to the growing level of anti-Asian violence that has been happening across our country, so that we are doing the best that we can as educators here at the university to educate our community of how these issues are deeply rooted in the society of the United States, as well as what we should be doing about this violence in our country to mitigate it, if not to rid it completely. So I thank you for joining us this lunch afternoon, and I hope that you are prepared for a wonderful treat. We have with us, joining us today, a brilliant scholar in Dr. Jason Oliver Chang. And again, I am grateful for his willingness to join us. He is the Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. He also serves as the Director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. He is the President of the Asian American Faculty and Staff Association, and he is an elected member of the West Hartford Public School Board of Education. We are just so thankful that you are able to join us here in Colorado from Connecticut because of the ways in which technology has brought us together over this past year. Dr. Chang, I am going to be quiet because no one came here to hear me. They definitely came to hear you. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you again for joining us.
All right. Wow. Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's an honor to be a part of this series. It looks like the lineup that you have posted in the chat looks tremendous. And I really think this is an important way to have conversations outside the classroom, and that the university is a leader in these kinds of public conversations. I think that's one of the duties of the public university. So I want to thank all the co-sponsors for making this happen, and my colleague Stephen Su and others for their work in making this event happen. This is just a wonderful chance for me to share some of the research I've been doing, some of the teaching, and also some of the lessons I've learned from this past year, and working to address media concerns, media requests, to help explain our circumstances. So I think what I'd like to do first is just have a recognition that that where I'm at in Connecticut is in indigenous territories of the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples, and that it's on this land that settlers occupied by force and enriched themselves through the enslavement of their indigenous neighbors and the importation and traffic of enslaved Africans. And it's from this place that I practice Asian American studies. And let's see here, do that. And I'm trying to get my screen right. Okay. So what I have planned for us today is to walk through a couple different lessons. in Asian American history. And I think rather than present something that's sort of more specific to my research, I've found that it's really important to establish a much bigger, broader picture of what Asian American studies, Asian American history is, because one of the reasons why we're experiencing the rise in violence and anti-Asian racism is because of the lack of understanding and the lack of context. And so, so if I could have the next slide. So this is going to be kind of an experiment where kind of put together a couple different things that have felt very significant to me as a historian, as a practitioner in Asian American studies, to kind of organize some major concepts and to provide some historical context for those as they relate to help explaining where we are today. So I'm going to present 3 lessons, one in migration, one in imperialism, and another in representation. And these are 3 different categories that I think kind of summarize some major points that are worth taking away from Asian American history. And those things inform what I've been thinking of as a kind of ethics of care in Asian American studies, and then also a set of actions that have been foremost on my mind. Next slide, please. So I have here a couple slides with the timeline of laws that have been directed at Asian migration from the United States, laws from the United States about Asian migration. And I know you're not supposed to use text-heavy slides in a presentation, but I think in some cases it's useful to see the sequence of laws and to have a little understanding of how legal precedence has generated a body of laws and created and invented specific forms of governance that shape our lives today. So, for instance, we start with the anti-coolie law in 1862. And this was an effort to ban the participation of Americans from the trade in indentured Asian workers. And not many folks know about this. It predates the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Page Act. But this was an effort to characterize all Asian men as slave-like laborers, and this kind of sets the stage for other laws that actually barred Asian migration to the United States, not just the participation in the trafficking. So what we see next is the Page Act in 1875, and this one is a fascinating law because it imagines the rationale for the exclusion of Chinese men and Chinese women along gendered and racialized ways, right? So Chinese women were barred in the Page Act because they were assumed to all be prostitutes, and that Chinese men were barred from immigration because they were assumed to be all cheap laborers. And these were important ways to contrast other politics in the United States, especially after the Civil War. And so some of the important context for understanding the development of anti-Asian immigration laws is that they were also happening in the context of Reconstruction after the Civil War, and that was an important way to to define who the ideal citizen was along racial lines, along class lines, and laborers. The category of laborer was an important way in which the United States worked out its racial politics. And so banning Chinese laborers became a way of preserving a kind of a romantic image of the free worker, and one which was not shared by African Americans even after Reconstruction. So another important lens by which to understand the development of these laws, going from the Page Act to the Exclusion Act in 1882 to the Scott Act and Geary Act in 1892, you see that these are successively more constraining, more restrictive, and broadening, and that these are part of the other side of exclusion, of Asian American exclusion from immigration, is that this is occurring alongside and concurrent with settler conquest of indigenous lands. And so here we see in this image, this cartoon, here we see that Uncle Sam is kicking a coolie worker out of California. And so one way to read this is that it's the U.S. government excluding Chinese workers from entering. Another way to look at this is that Uncle Sam is standing on indigenous lands and is making sure that these new lands are occupied by white settlers. And so that's another way in which we can read these exclusion acts in a larger context. Can I have the next slide? So as we progress through the 20th century, we see the intensification and expansion of the exclusion laws beyond the Chinese to include Japanese, then to include all of Asia, basically, with the Immigration Act of 1917, which generates the Asiatic Barred Zone. I have a map for that in the next slide. But before we do that, I wanted to, an important point to make about this period of immigration legislation targeting Asians is that while we have the expansion and restriction of immigration, it corresponds with the growth in U.S. empire abroad, and that these are kind of contradictory, gestures. On the one hand, you're excluding. On the other hand, it's the U.S. military that's going to Asia. That in particular, we have the Spanish-American War and the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, beginning in 1898, which I'll get to in a later slide. But we see here that at each stage of expansion is a kind of recognition that Asian migrants solved certain industrial expansion problems. The expansion of industrial agriculture, the expansion of industrial infrastructure with the railroads, the expansion of industrial manufacturing in the West Coast. Different Asian migrations satisfied different demands of expansion. And after that expansion, that phase of expansion expired, they were then excluded, right? So we can see here a pattern in which Asian migrants were desired and welcomed, and then made to be disposable. And I think that's a theme across Asian American history, that there's both a desire and a disposability, and that is one way to kind of characterize Asian American racialization, that I think we can see that theme in other areas that we'll touch on. Okay, next slide. Just real quickly, this is just a map of the Asiatic Barred Zone in 1917, drawn up to exclude people from the green zone from immigrating and naturalizing in the United States. Next slide. All right, then in the late 20th century, we see a kind of political opening and a recognition that immigration policies had a political utility to influence both geopolitics as well as the Black-led civil rights movement, the 60s and 70s. And so, we see the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943 as a way of bringing the Chinese into the Allied fight in Asia. And then in 1952, with the McCarran-Walter Act, it begins to generate, more more opportunity for Asian migrants to enter the United States with the rise of communism, right? As a factor in kind of competing for the goodwill of migrants. And then ultimately, 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, we have a real transformation of the immigration system from a national quota system that was designed to exclude non-whites to then one based on merits and class and employer sponsorship, including family reunification. Then we have another major change in 1975 with the Indochina Migration Refugee Assistance Act, and this generates a new category in which the United States can recuperate its political image in the aftermath of the loss in Vietnam. And so despite these kinds of openings, we have a return of the security state at the end of the 20th century with the Homeland Security Act and the creation of ICE in 2002. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the reasons why Asians are in the United States is because of US imperialism. There's this kind of saying that we are here because you came to us. And that's in some ways a recognition of the push and pull forces which shape migration and the unequal terms in which people are made to make those kinds of choices. So at the very earliest, we can see one of the first episodes of U.S. imperialism in Asia is in 1832 in Kuala Batu, Sumatra. And here we see a painting of U.S. Marines sacking Kuala Batu as a rebuke against their refusal to trade in chilies, a spice. And this wasn't because they were using it, but because they wanted to trade it themselves, right? So, so I think here it's important to identify a couple different meanings of imperialism. So. I'll use two in this presentation, so one is economic and the other is cultural. So in some ways we can look at imperialism as a stage of capitalism, in which the need to sustain a mode of production or a system of profit, which requires the access to cheap labor and resources of colonies, and the ability to circulate those commodities safely or under military protection is one definition of imperialism. Another is that it is cultural, and that it provides the rationale and the political discourse of benevolent inclusion, or as was used in the turn of the century during the Spanish-American War, benevolent assimilation. And so we'll look at a couple examples. I've also decided to use artwork in this part of the presentation because it has become a useful teaching mechanism for me to think about the multifacetedness of wars, and that they span both time and space in ways that extend beyond the heat of the battlefield, for instance. And art has a way of communicating many of the things that we feel are significant, but maybe aren't captured in a single photo, or can be captured in a block quote. So I feel like there's a real use for art in this particular dimension of explaining Asian American history. Can I have the next slide? So here is a front page of the newspaper, the Boston Sunday Globe, 1898, and explaining, this is an example of the cultural dimension of imperialism, of U.S. imperialism. Here we see an effort to explain the cultural rationale. So here it's saying that there's expansion, which is the gesturing to the military defeat of the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, and then the military occupation of the archipelago, and then saying that there's juxtaposing the native Filipino before occupation and after U.S. occupation, what the hopes are for the transformation of Filipinos. And so there are various images here that represent a kind of an aggregate of the different racialized experiences of Native Americans in the United States, as well as African Americans. And so the Philippines becomes a kind of, palette in which those prior historical experiences get played out again in order to explain the military and economic project of occupying and dominating the Philippine archipelago. All right, can I have the next slide? Here we see a painting by Hideo Kimura. It's depicting the atomic attack on Hiroshima in 1945. And so here, we see an example of the kind of mass violence that U.S. wars in Asia have generated, and this is an entree to the much longer U.S. occupation of Japan that happens after the war, from 1945 to 1952, and so we see here again another interpretation of the disposability of Asian life as it's experienced in warfare, that no other place was selected for the atomic attack, but that this was deemed an appropriate target for the mass killing of civilians, as well as there were military targets and industrial targets, but this was the single most devastating attack in war on the planet. Can I have the next slide? Here we see another painting which depicts the secret war in Cambodia, 1970s. And this is by Cao Thao, and it's entitled The Hmong Migration. And here we see a depiction of the U.S. military's bombing campaign to eliminate the routes around Vietnam through Cambodia that were sustaining some of the forces there in the U.S.-Vietnam War. So one of the things that is important to take away here is that, you know, there were more bombs dropped in Southeast Asia during this war than in all of World War II. And, you know, again, we see this kind of disposability, the kind of disregard for human life as it's racialized in warfare in Asia. And, you know, while it's not depicted in here, these particular military episodes leave a shadow, and it's most recognized by the military base. The military base becomes a node for the continued presence of the U.S. empire. It's also, you know, a moment. This is also a good moment to reflect on the gender-based violence that is a part of all warfare, and that there is a particular you know, way that that's lived in the U.S. experience in Asia, and that gender-based violence, violence against women, is one practice of warfare by the U.S. military in fact other militaries, that we can also see this through, say, the practice of sexual slavery by the Japanese military in the comfort women issue, right? So this isn't unique to the United States, but it is an important experience to recognize, because we see it reflected back in our culture, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Can I have the next slide? Right. So now when I share a piece of artwork that I made, this is a collage that I'm calling Empire's Distance. And it was a demonstration that I did for my students in a project that I called the Speculative Atlas of Asian America. And what is combined here is archival map of the Boston naval yards, and overlaid on the a U.S. Navy sounding map of the Hong Kong harbor, and then a stereographic picture from Manila in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. And then we have the silhouettes of U.S. warships that participated in the Spanish-American War, with a cutout of depiction of the uniforms, the special uniforms designed for U.S. military occupation in the Philippines. And so this is a way for me to kind of meditate on the different connections, the geographic connections between a domestic space of, say, Boston Harbor with the requirements of, you know, recoaling fueling stations in Hong Kong that made the military assault on the Philippines possible, right? So in some ways it's hard to show that in a single image, but I felt like this was a way to demonstrate that. And indeed, what I tried to show my students here is try to ask them to turn their learning into aesthetic choices. What ways can you use how you understand history to shape the kinds of, you know, artistic choices that you might make? So can I have the next slide? So here's an example from a student, Sarah Canseco, who was researching Filipino migration to California. and used archival images and used her research to kind of show this this disintegration both of the Philippines and of California kind of mixing together, and then with this profile of a Filipino worker replicated in the image. I just found this really beautiful, and she wrote a really stunning essay off of this. And I think, you know, these are just another example of the ways that we can use Asian American history to create new meanings of you know, for today, and that art is an important way to reflect on the legacies of warfare. Can I have the next image? So the third lesson that I wanted to share was on representation, and so you know, with the rise in anti-Asian racism really coming to a head with the onset of the pandemic, we get in touch with a deep reservoir of discourses and representations of Asians as enemies, as irredeemable foreigners, and disease vectors, and that what is happening today, the kind of language used to describe the virus as an Asian as an Asian disease is not new, but it demonstrates the utility, the political power of these kinds of discourses to capture people's minds and to displace a medical and scientific understanding with a political understanding, right? So what I've collected here is a couple images from the late 19th century, early 20th century that show that the racialized imagination of Asians has incorporated a really, you know, grotesque kind of repertoire of representations that allow and justify the kind of treatment that that Asian Americans receive, both in terms of violence, but also in terms of citizenship and the security of their communities. So could I have the next slide? So here we're getting a little bit closer into the second half of the 20th century. We see there were two other pandemics that emerged in 1957 and 1968 that were out that had their beginnings in China, and here we can see the kind of fear mongering around with this 1957 advertisement for cold medicine, that, you know, this kind of, you know, vulnerable female image, you know, with the concern for children, and, you know, underscored by this the specter of an invisible Asian invasion. Then, you know, we also see in 1968 we see these the representation of these viruses as menacing henchmen, and then a vaccination hesitant American considering whether or not to get a vaccine or to wrestle with these henchmen. And then again with SARS in 2003, this depiction of the Chinese takeout box as a representation of a disease vector. All right, can I have the next slide? So what I'm going to share now are a couple slides that from a presentation I made a year ago, right? So these are, example. This is what the scene looked like to me, a year ago. And so, we see the first 2 weeks of April had 1,000 incidents of reported, attacks. And now, I mean, that there were 1,000 attacks a day earlier in the year. And so, we really see an escalation in this, in the pattern of anti-Asian violence and racism. Can I have the next slide? So these were two other people who, at the height of the rate of infection out here on the East Coast, was corresponding with a rise in attacks on Asian American healthcare workers, and it felt such a contrast and an impossible situation to consider that these are people saving lives and trying to contain a deadly pandemic, and also being targeted. And really, I was meditating on the significance of Filipino nurses as an important population in our healthcare system, and that they have a really long history of serving this particular occupationally because of the relationship of U.S. imperialism that dates back to the last century. And after speaking with some Filipino nurses at the time, they expressed this saying that I just thought was so haunting and beautiful at the same time. Is Dalawang Buslo, which meant honoring the pain and the joy of their occupation, and really captured at the time a crisis moment for them and for a lot of us. So can I have the next slide? So we have a year later, we're looking at these experiences in Atlanta, Georgia, and where 8 people were murdered. That in Indianapolis, we see the mass shooting of workers at FedEx, and half of which were Sikh Americans. And it makes me think about how Asian American history reveals a really significant and deep reservoir of historical experiences and politics and accumulated violences, that when we don't know that history, right, it will creep back into our lives because people are making sense of the world, and that these are powerful ideas that have shaped a nation for more than a century. And that just because this generation doesn't have the lived experience or the learned knowledge of it, doesn't mean that it's going to die and go away. This experience has also made me reflect on the calls for more policing to protect Asians in this period, to protect Asian Americans in this period of increased racism and violence, and that and wondering, how there's a focus on hate crimes, and that they still don't seem to be the answer, because hate crimes only address a problem after it's happened. And there's a real need to think more broadly about this, it's also made me reflect on the hashtag Stop Asian Hate, or Stop AAPI Hate, or Stop Asian Hate. And while, you know, we could contrast this with like Black Lives Matter and the call for police, the abolition, or to abolish the police, you know, to me, there's, you know, while we see these acts of violence being being perpetrated by individuals, not exactly law enforcement, we run the risk of individualizing this pattern, and it makes me kind of think about the potential for this to ignore this larger and deeper history, right? So so I think there's a real need to really evaluate what, you know, the underlying forces, and to think about a much broader kind of interpretation that's not just about protecting, you know, individuals or prosecuting violent attackers. Although I do appreciate the, you know, the need for accountability, I think it signals a much deeper problem as experienced in this history. So I want to save some space for conversation with y'all. So I want to skip ahead to the ethics of care slide. Can we do that? Great, thank you. And so, you know, what this last year has really shown me is that Asian American studies is really useful to people, and it is an important way in which we can take care of ourselves by understanding the forces which shape our that don't make us well, and that when we attend to these deeper structural features, that you know, that we actually become more more able to take care of ourselves and to fight those things that that are hurting us. So what I'm going to do is paste in here a link to a workbook that I made with some community partners here in Connecticut. This is our Asian American Mental Health Workbook that combines art from the Asian American Literary Review's tarot card project, which uses their tarot cards, along with Asian American literature, some examples from history, and that these we felt were really important mechanisms for demonstrating, you know, how Asian Americans and how Asian American studies can help us in this moment of crisis. So other folks have found it really useful. So I think circulating in, you know, maybe a dozen campuses, and we're going to be using it in the School of Engineering this year at UConn as well. And last slide, please. And then lastly, I wanted to just reflect on, you know, after we understand this history, what do we do next? What should we do with this information, with this knowledge? And I think, you know, this signals back to what I've always held about ethnic studies, that it is not just a set of electives to round out a liberal arts degree, but ethnic studies really is an effort to transform the university. And, you know, that we have really this ethnic studies is the result of a social movement, and that the goal was not just to create courses, but that those courses would then allow for the transformation of our communities and of the institutions of higher learning. And so, really want to, support and expand ethnic studies. One of the things I've done at UConn is to generate activist residencies, where we bring activists into the university to demonstrate their expertise. Right? You don't have to have a PhD to be an expert, and then also to start a student activism archive, because as we all know, students graduate, and sometimes their learning and their struggles go with them. And so if we can establish a much longer kind of memory about student activism, we have a greater chance of continuing those struggles. And that, this last year has really showed me that the job of Asian American Studies is also to have more public-facing research. And with that recognition is that we also need to change the criteria for tenure in our system, so that faculty actually have more engagement with community change and being a part of community organizations. And then one other thing that we found useful is the development of faculty and staff association. At UConn, Asian Americans are the largest non-white group in the university, but because of the numerical status of Asian Americans, they aren't considered minorities by the university. And so the faculty and staff association is a needed voice to bring to those offices that aren't considering Asian Americans as minorities. And then, really every year I teach Asian American history, and my students tell me, why did I have to wait so long to learn this? Why did I have to wait till college to learn about my history? And that's why I've been pursuing education reform in the primary and secondary fields in Connecticut. I've been championing this bill, HB 6619, that seeks to bring Asian American and Pacific Islander studies to the K through 8 curriculum. And so we just passed, the bill just passed through the Appropriations Committee yesterday. So I'm very hopeful that we continue that bill. And then lastly, solidarity, that we really need to work with each other, understand the differences in our struggles, and to work alongside each other. And so I think, with that, I just want to, thank everyone for tuning in, and would really, love the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Chang, for that informative and inspirational presentation. So my name is Stefan Chosa, and I'm an assistant professor of sociology and women's ethnic studies here at UCCS, and I'll serve as a discussion moderator for the remainder of the event. We have a little more than 10 minutes remaining, which should be enough time to get to several questions before the event is over. We'll begin with questions that are already posed in the YouTube live stream chat. If other viewers have questions they'd like answered, you are encouraged to post them in the chat as well, and we'll try our best to get to as many as we can with the time that we have remaining. So the first question I see is from someone named Mona Casino, and they ask several questions, in fact, and many of which engage with the last few slides that you presented, Dr. Chang. So they ask, where do you see the tendency for Asians to become convenient targets during periods of national crisis ending? How can we keep from repeating history? And do you have, or do you see reasons to be hopeful?
Thank you. I'm just taking notes here. Where does it end? Well, I think, my the intellectual side of me says, well, we can't have healing without accountability, and so I think that means a much deeper reckoning with the histories of imperialism and warfare and racialized violence that's shaped Asian American communities. And I think, bringing those historical experiences to the surface do important cultural and political work that recognizes the vulnerabilities that people have been in, but then also that that there is a history of white impunity, and that we can't expect to change something without changing that. And I think there's, at its most fundamental level, I think this is about white supremacy as it's practiced domestically and and globally. We see, we could look at war as the expression of racism abroad, and so I think, with a more attentive and committed kind of public culture about reckoning with the past, I think that's one way to alter the conversation, because by focusing on just the here and now, we leave all of these open wounds unattended. And indeed, there's, is it possible to heal from that? I don't know the answer to that, but if we don't do it, then we really run the risk of allowing this this pain to continue to shape our lives, and so I think, one thing that hasn't been done, that we haven't tried, is a transformation of our education system. And I really, I believe, ethnic studies has shaped my life in important ways, and I really believe it to also be an important way to change our public school system that can make it more effective, but also serve more people, and that the outcomes of that system are really geared towards the changes that we want to see. Not just that that they might have marketable skills, right, but that they're the kind of citizen that's going to take care of themselves and take care of other people. And hopefulness, I was just speaking with some high school students at Farmington who are running a summit, a social justice activism summit. They're bringing student groups together from, I think, 5 different, maybe it's 7 different high schools to do work together. And I was so inspired by their fearlessness and their knowledge of their own struggle and their enthusiasm for building community across these high schools in the midst of this pandemic. So I am hopeful. It's the youth that are leading the charge here, so I try to follow them.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. So we have another question from Ann Amakuchi. They ask, Dr. Chang, would you talk more about activist residencies and the ways they can involve students in activist work?
Mm-hmm. That's right. So so it was after the start of the pandemic And after the lockdown, that I got in touch with Mike Keogh, who is the founder of the I'm Not a Virus campaign, in a portrait series, a portrait campaign that tried to show the humanity of Asian Americans in the midst of this rising anti-Asian violence. And really, it showed that there's many important ways of communicating the insights and significance of Asian American studies that that I hadn't really considered. As an academic, we're trained to write articles and books and to write lectures, and that those weren't the kinds of intellectual labor that was going to affect the communities that needed our help the most. And when I met Mike, I realized too that activists don't always have the resources they need to build the things that they see as most useful. So it was really a combination of us joining forces to put the power of an R1 research university, a public research university, behind the work of a community activist and leader to generate more capacity to reach more people, to do campaigns that targeted specific events and populations, and it also was a way to demonstrate to students what you can do with an Asian American Studies degree. That this isn't just a course that you could take, to experiment in your liberal arts education, but this is a field of study that can teach you about the history, culture, and politics of the fastest growing immigrant group in the country and the largest geographic region of the planet. And that's going to give you a real sense of how to apply knowledge, whether it's medical knowledge, if you want to be a nurse or you want to be a doctor. Working with immigrant communities is going to be an everyday experience. If you want to be an engineer, you're going to work in international teams, probably speaking many different languages, and that these are skills that are designed to bring Asian American studies and anti-racist thinking and practices into different occupations and fields that don't think that those areas of study apply to them. And so this is the real magic of Asian American studies, of ethnic studies in the university, that we have to pair these things together, and that through that work we can expand the transformation to the work towards anti-racism. And of course we're all implicit in it because we work within these structures, and we're all implicated in this. And so the more that we can identify and make it explicit those things, the more that we lessen the power it has over us. And so I think that bringing activists into the university space is delicate, though, because there's a long history of exploiting activists in the university space. And so we have a really careful consideration of, consciously inverting the power dynamic, and to ensuring that the relationship is not extractive. And so, we really want to use this as a way to emphasize the work that they're doing, but then also, amplify the student voices, the student activists who are doing similar work. And so in doing that, we've had some really exciting experiences.
So I do believe that we are unfortunately out of time. So at this time, I'd like to thank Dr. Chang and also to pass the screen over to Dr. Stephanie Rose Spalding.
Yes, we are certainly tremendously grateful for all that you have shared. This was a wonderful talk, Dr. Chang. We will have to have you back, and hopefully someday in person when we are post COVID pandemic restrictions. I want to again just thank you for all that you have shared with our campus today. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, because the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion did not do this by themselves. We are partnered with the Matrix Center, the Department of History, as well as the Social Science Symposium series. So again, thank you to all of our partners. And then I also want to encourage those who are watching to share the link that will be available after the end of this conversation, so that others who might not have been able to tune in during the lunch hour today can also get the benefit of what Dr. Chang has shared with us. And Saturday, our young people, our students on campus are hosting an APISU March Against Asian Hate. So that is our Asian Pacific Islander Student Union. They are hosting a March Against Asian Hate. This is going to be Saturday, April 24th. It was rescheduled from last weekend because, of course, Colorado, sometimes it snows in April. And it will be from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Please, they will be gathering at University Village. If you want more information about that, make sure you tune into our social media presence. It is on Mountain Lion Connect, as well as the Facebook and Twitter, Instagram pages of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And then next week, we will round out our Teach-In series with the solidarities and fault lines. It will be a panel discussion of a number of tremendous scholars that we have right here at UCCS. If you don't know, we do have an Asian Studies minor. So for our students, please take advantage of that. That will be April 28th from 3 to 4:30. So again, we just want to make sure that you all know this is not a one-time thing. We are invested in the work of doing equity and inclusion with our diverse communities here at UCCS intentionally. Please join us for these other events. Take the courses. And again, Dr. Chang, thank you so much for all that you have shared and provided us this afternoon.